Okay, everybody. I think we are going to start. We don't have one of our speakers, but she is due here any second. So welcome to the London sunshine, and welcome to you. You have all foregone the opportunities of a beer in the park for the joys of the Swiss model, FTAs and single markets and customs unions and all of that. It will be, I think, a very interesting discussion. Less than a year to go before we leave, still so much in flux. We've heard lots about Norwegian models and Canadian models, but rather less about the Swiss model. So I'm very pleased to welcome Michael Ambühl, who, in fact, this whole event is really happened partly by chance. Well, you very sweetly got in touch with me when I happened to be in Zurich a few months ago, and told me that the Swiss model was going underreported in Britain, and I think you're absolutely right about that. So I said I would do something about it, and so in this small way, I am. We discovered that we both knew Ivan, who was, of course, the former permanent representative of the UK to the European Union, and is now one of the foremost experts on Brexit and what's going on in the known universe, I think it's fair to say. Michael, by the way, is a professor of negotiation and conflict management now at the ETH in Zurich, but he is a former Swiss state secretary and has much experience of negotiating with the Brussels machine. We are also waiting for Allie Renison from the Institute of Directors. She's head of Europe and Trade Policy at the Institute of Directors. She's just arrived back on a plane from somewhere and should be with us in the next 5 or 10 minutes. But what we're going to do is Michael is going to do a little slideshow on the Swiss model, lasting about 15 minutes. Yep. We will then have a kind of brief specific, some kind of factual questions on his presentation, not a kind of major. We don't want to broaden it out at that point. Just stick to any queries that anybody might have about Michael's presentation. And while we're having that brief sort of sub Q&A, Ralph will remove the screen, and we will all sit up here, and then Ivan will speak for 15 minutes or so, and Ali too, and then we will have a discussion. What time are we meant to end? 7:45? Right, okay. Good. So without further ado, Michael, the Swiss model.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very grateful that you invited me for a brief presentation of the Swiss model. Where next on Brexit, that was the title you have given, and you asked also lessons from the Swiss model. I'm of course not here to say that there are many lessons to be taken. This is not up to me to lecture you, a big nation, United Kingdom, and you have much more experience with the European Union than we, the Swiss. We have never been in, and you are, of course, very well equipped with all the knowledge for negotiations. What I would like to propose to you, I will very briefly present the Swiss model. Then I will in particular come to the customs union, or rather non-customs union of the Swiss, and the single market access of the Swiss. So it's always from a Swiss point of view, but it will be rather easy to see that there are really some parallel with the UK, and then the lessons learned, if there are any, the Swiss have learned so far. So the Swiss model, what is it about? The goal is to have legal certainty and market access knowing that the Swiss are in the middle of the European Union. We are a small country, but we are economically and demographically heavily integrated. But there has never been a strong will to become a full member. And as the European Union, if I may say so, is not maybe in the best of its forms right now for other questions than the Swiss or the British, there is not really a big tendency to become a member of the European Union. Also, basically due to the fact that we think, the majority thinks, we are in a quite good situation economically, politically, and you might know the Swiss have this strange thing we call referendum. We have many referenda during the year, and most of us are aware that while we join, this would be reduced. It would not become impossible, but if a directive or an ordinance is a directive or what's the word? The
Regulation.
Regulation
yeah.
is decided in Brussels, then you just have to follow. Fair enough. Okay, now just a graphic presentation. Where did the Swiss bilateral model start? Basically, I would say with a free trade agreement in 1973. Paradoxically, it was exactly on the day, it was on the 1st January 73,
yeah.
when UK plus Ireland and the Danes joined. That was not just an accident, that was really because you left, if I say you, I always mean the UK, you left the EFTA, and we stayed, but we wanted to have a free trade agreement. And now I'm saying, ironically, maybe also at the end of your life cycle in the European Union, this might also have an influence on us. So we started with this, I call it bilateral 0. Of course, at that time, nobody was speaking like this. Then we have a second, that is what we call now the real bilateral one, 7 agreements, they are listed here. They are all linked together because the union wanted to have one package. So that was, these negotiations became necessary because Switzerland rejected the EEA, the European Economic Area. That is what normally you call here the Norwegian model. And then we had a follow-up, another one, so that was only trade, then it was going into economy, and now it also was then politics in these 9 areas. This was then my job as the so-called Swiss chief negotiator. I did these negotiations. So my experience with the European Union comes mainly from bilateral discussions, negotiations with our European Union friends. That's where we are, and now there is the debate, do we have so-called bilateral free? Do we have other agreements? The European Union would like to have a so-called institutional agreement where they would say the agreements here, these here, are sort of static agreement. So you take over an acquis, but you don't take the future acquis. You have to then, or the acquis is the EU body of law. You have then to negotiate always, and now the European Union would like to have the whole thing to make it dynamic, a little bit like the so-called Norwegian model. That is what it's about here, and we are actually, as you know, currently in negotiations. Advantages of this model, I'll try to be very brief, so it is not very nuanced, but you asked me, David, to be short. So we have certainly legal certainty and a better market access. We have the market access only for the selected policy sectors. So we don't have a coverage of the whole market. We don't have a broad market access, but we have a sort of a selective market access only. And we have, of course, a certain level of freedom regarding legislation and policies that are not selected. And this is the economic policy, foreign trade policy, where we would say we have the treaty-making power maintained in free trade areas, meaning we can have a free trade agreement with China or with India. And monetary policy, taxation, finance, social policy, foreign policy, agriculture. So these are the areas where we are more or less free. Of course, you're never free unless you live on the moon. Here you always have to take into account your neighbors and the big ones and the smaller ones. So that's the main advantage for staying outside, I would say. The disadvantage, we have no full participation in the selected areas like Schengen or Dublin or free trade. Of course, we have only possibility to participate in the so-called decision shaping, not in the decision making. There we have nothing to say. I'm not criticizing this. I would say fair enough. I mean, if you're not member of the club, you cannot say I want to be participant. And we have no participation at all in all other areas, which is also very clear. We have not all the market access we would like to have due to the fact that we have right now also some reluctance for the demands of our European Union friends regarding the dynamization of the bilateral. And as we hear there or so, EU seems to regret it. They say it was a mistake. I allow myself to make a question mark, even a big one. As a negotiator, you're always happy if one tells you we made a mistake to make an agreement with you, because that's good. Otherwise, you are a bad negotiator.
Well, you're a
and
professor
we
of
are,
negotiation.
you do pick and choose, and that is what they don't like. Of course, a negotiator has to pick and choose, otherwise he has to do cherry picking. He should take this. I'm personally convinced this model is also for the benefit of the European Union. They would never ever have agreed such a model if they would not have wanted it. I mean, imagine we 6-7 million Alpine guys, cowboys there, trying to impose our views on the 500 million block. I mean, it's just ridiculous. So they are certainly very happy with it. They might not like it because it gives them a little bit too much work, which I understand. Mm-hmm. So that was the first part. Just briefly to customs union. Here's some facts. I think they are quite important. So the Swiss border crossings per day, please, per day. We have 2.2 million persons crossing Swiss-EU border per day, not per year, per day. And this means million, not thousand. And 23,000 lorries, about 1 billion of trade, only goods, trade in goods, not services, which I would think contributes to a cost increase of 0.1% of the value of trade. That's what you have to pay. And we have a very heavily computerized declaration system now in trade in advance, and about 1% of physical controls. That's the situation we have with the European Union. And you know we have a land border. We are encircled of all European Union. There are no other guys except Liechtenstein, very small, tiny country, which is not member. Switzerland is not member of the customs union. Advantage, I would say, we are free to conclude free trade agreement on our own, as we have done with China, which is in force now for almost 3 years. India, I'm not pretending that this is a super deal. There are discussions whether the Chinese got more than we, and you always have these discussions. With India, we are in negotiations, but that is the treaty-making power. The disadvantage, you have border controls. However, to nuance it, the noticeability, the visibility can be reduced by new technology. And as I would now say, Ireland and UK, as non-Schengen members, are free to determine the density of controls. I mean, if they agree, they can say we have 0 or we do this. As you are not in Schengen, we who are in Schengen, we are not totally free. So single market.
Border controls on people, huh?
Yes,
Not
that is for goods. And for people, basically zero border control, as we are in Schengen.
Yep.
So the advantage is, paradoxically, the non-membership in customs union, which allows the customs control to say, please open your, the coffer, and we check if you have too many salamis. And if by checking the salamis, they can also check, are there some bombs in it? And then they can go against them. But it always indirectly through the trade point that we can check persons. Otherwise, in Schengen, it's not allowed. You can check persons only away from the border. Single market access, sectorial access only in selected policies. It is, I would say, that is now a very, very simplistic presentation. It's something in between the Canadian FTA and the so-called Norwegian model. We have certainly more market access than the Canadians, and we have more flexibility than the Norwegian model, which is à la carte. Our is à la carte instead of a full menu. And coming to the end, lessons learned. I would say, as an outsider, and even a small one, contrary to you, you are a big one. You have a total different history. You have a different power, and you have been in, or you're still in. I would say, a small guy like us, we have only in negotiations a good chance under 3 conditions. That is my wisdom summarized from the negotiations. First, I'm talking Swiss. I'm not saying this is applicable for you. But if you do not question fundamental principles, because questioning fundamental principles of non-discrimination, of equal treatment, let's say, certain ideas that the market access is a package and so on, it is hopeless to frontally question this and say, no, we take only, out of the 4 freedoms, we take only 1 and maybe and a half here. I would say for us it would be impossible. However, if we focus on the flexibility in the implementation of the principles, I think there we have a chance. And the European Union, our friends, are very renowned for having a big flexibility. Maybe from the outside, one could even say maybe a too big flexibility while they implement their principles. I give here as a keywords Maastricht, Stability Pact, refugees, saying there the flexibility is really immense. And I did it at my chair at our institute. We once calculated what could be a safeguard clause in migration. We published this here. If somebody's interested, we have a couple of copies here. And this is just to show you safeguard clauses is something which is not an invention by the Swiss or a Swiss diplomat. It is very well there. It exists as a tool. And here we have calculated, please apologize, I'm a mathematician, so we do some mathematics. But we have done this in this paper. If you're interested, you can there see how you could turn the model. Technical solutions are always also accepted in the European Union. And I continue. If that was the first one, the second one, if you have a certain nuisance value, then you have a chance to come in. However, you can not only use the nuisance value, but you also have to contribute in a constructive way, like the Swiss with the Transalpine tunnels. Yeah. Maybe to make a jump to you, you as a big power in security, that is, of course, certainly something welcome. And that's it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Let me just sort of chair a kind of first brief round of Q&A just on the Swiss stuff, while Ralph transforms the stage. Oh, everybody wants to ask questions about it. Okay. Yeah.
Very simple question. What costs were included in the 0.1% of the royalty?
The costs for making the computerized formulas you have maybe 10 minutes to wait. Hopefully, if you do it well in advance, you can even pass through.
You're saying cost to the consumer or the shipper?
Of the shipper.
So it's not the cost to the government?
No, it's not the cost of the government. It contributes, of course, it's an administration, a good one or a bad one, but it contributes to bureaucracy. And if we calculate the trade volume and put it in relation with the costs, with what the customs brings in, then this is the 0.1%.
So just to make sure I understand, you take your assessment of cost to the trader and divide that on average by what he's trading, 0.1%.
Exactly.
And would that be different for people who are operating within the computerization system?
Yes,
So that
this is all.
versus the 1% who
I don't know this exactly. It's just
just get that for the people watching online.
okay. Yeah. So it's just all over, huh?
Yeah, Dominic.
Yes. One question. You mentioned the fact that you're in Schengen, UK and Ireland aren't. But of course, UK and Ireland since 2023 had a common travel area. So in fact, for the
Like
most
Schengen,
part, it
yeah.
would be essentially as liberal as your model, would it not?
I think so, yeah. Well, what I wanted to say is Schengen. I negotiated this. It was then also contested. We had a vote. I think 55% were then in favor of Schengen and the others against. But all in all, I think it was a success for us. And we maintain formally customs control due to the fact that we are not in the customs union. But this doesn't contribute to any difficulties. Our big custom postings are in Basel and in Geneva, in the middle of the city, So there is no parking lot for trucks, and of course people, the citizens do not like to have problems, and that's, I just wanted to say, is solved. On a pragmatic way with our German and the French customs
You're
officers.
right in the middle. I mean, people don't want to go round you. You're right in the middle.
Yes.
So you have to have something like Schengen.
Sure. Yes, sure. It's geographically a totally different situation from yours. I'm not pretending that I'm not making the plaidoyer for Schengen for you.
Yeah.
Yes, Professor Ambühl, since Switzerland, though in your own words a small country, is also a plainly solvent one in terms of current account balances, in terms of budget levels, and in terms of low public debt. How far has this proved an asset in negotiations compared with, let us say, a prospective country wishing to imitate the Swiss model, which might not find itself in such a fortunate financial position?
I understand your question. I think this might play a role if you are Ukrainian or Moldavian and you want to join, then they might say, we do not like to take over a country having a lot of economic difficulties. So I would think, but Ivan knows this much better, if the Swiss would say tomorrow, could we become candidate country, they might not say no. They might say, yes, welcome, because that's another contributor, net contributor.
I'll just take a couple more. I mean, you can always come back later if the lady there.
No, that answered my question.
Right, no, yeah. Lady there?
I just wanted to find out, how do you deal with, there must be a lot of goods going right through Switzerland, say if something's going
Transit.
from Italy to
Yeah.
in transit, how do you deal with that in terms of customs?
The same way, but we have an agreement, the customs agreement, which gives us a waiver that we do not have to participate in this so-called 24-hour ruling. the European Union, after 9/11, introduced the 24 hours, that the United States introduced the 24 hours pre-announcement of containers, which was annoying for everybody. So the European Union did the same, and we, the Swiss, were another third country. So we had to negotiate a special agreement that we have the same deal as member states.
Quick one.
Was this too technical?
No, not enough, actually.
Well,
I'll talk to you later.
Okay.
About 40% of British exports go to the EU market, but that's full. What percentage of Swiss
60.
exports? Right. And secondly, EU directives and regulations, do they apply behind borders? Obviously, you have to comply with export requirements, but is the Swiss political system free to diverge from EU directives in terms of the internal regulation of Swiss business?
No, that's exactly the purpose, to have this market access, and not only based on a free trade agreement where you just don't have, I'm simplifying, customs. You don't have customs, you have zero customs, but if you have market access, you take over the basic regulations regarding Cassis de Dijon and all goods, so that we do not have additional border control. So
That also means you accept free movement and you accept the European Court of Justice. You are...
No, not the European Court
the
of
ECJ.
Justice.
Right,
That
okay.
is that is what we call foreign judges. So that is then really,
Right.
really, with this you kill all negotiations.
Right, but
with
you
the
do
European
accept free
Union.
movement, albeit with some qualifications.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But on goods, of course, it is a harmonized regulation. So we take over more or less the same rules as the European Union. And that is from a political point of view. For people loving sovereignty, they say, we don't like this. We have to take over. It's a satellitization, it's a colonization of Switzerland. And we, with our 700 years proud being independent, so there you can put a lot of political argument in it. But I would say, all in all, it functions very well.
Just a very quick one, and then...
You had a referendum a couple of years back on freedom of movement.
Yes.
Swiss voted to stop freedom of movement. So what has happened with that?
No, we accepted free movement of people in a vote in 2000 when we accepted the so-called bilateral one. We accepted it. It was a 62% yes. Now there was the wish to have some control in migration. And there we could not realize it to the word of the Constitution. It was then watered down to a point which is acceptable for European Union. I produced, yes, it is accepted. We have no...
Accepted for the European Union, but not for the people that voted.
Yeah, I think politically it's accepted. Otherwise, we would have more difficulty. And it was then, otherwise we would have, again, a referendum on it, and we don't have it. What I think the solution for this squaring of the circle problem is to have a safeguard, which is quite interesting. I think you call it here emergency clause.
Yeah. Emergency
An
brake.
emergency clause saying if you have a too big influx of foreigners from the European Union, if they are outside the European Union, you are in any case free because you have not regulated this. Then if you have too much, you can then apply such a break.
Final, very quick one.
Just to clarify, was that the watering down that you referred to, this agreement as effectively an emergency break which prevents, you can exercise restraint on freedom of movement?
Yes, you see, the constitutional article would say we have to reintroduce quotas, which is, of course, a no-go for Brussels. You cannot have free movement of persons and quotas. So that's a contradiction per se. So the proposal could be to say, instead of going for quotas, because you don't get this, forget this, this is one of the fundamental principles, you should not even try to start negotiation this, is to have a good a safeguard clause. Now, in our free movement of persons agreement, we have such a safeguard clause. It is Article 14.2. It's in there, it's very well there. It's not in concrete words. Now, what one could do just to give some content, more content to this. That is what we tried also, once again, to also make, that's a proposal from the outside, from the Swiss, how it could be in case UK would go for such a solution.
Great. Now, well, let's move on. Thank you very much indeed, Michael. We'll come back to you. Yeah. Michael, yeah, well, why don't you join us here? And over to you, Ivan, for some thoughts on that and more general thoughts about where we are with the negotiations.
Great. Well, thanks, David. First of all, for convening this, because as you say, this is sort of the dog that has not barked so far, and virtually every other bloody model seems to have barked so far, and the Swiss one hasn't, and it's one of the most interesting, and Michael presents it very brilliantly. It's always a pleasure to hear him and to follow him on an occasion like this, because he's extremely clear about what the Swiss model is and isn't. And the big problem with our debate remains, of course, that though there's a plethora of models out there, from Norway to Canada to Ukraine to Turkey to EFTA. Jersey, Guernsey, I've heard just about all of them. Actually, there's tremendous public confusion and media confusion, I think, about what all of them are. So it's quite helpful, first of all, I saw my old Norwegian opposite number in Brussels the other day, and she's exasperated by the British media and parliamentary coverage of the Norwegian model, because she thinks it's a complete misunderstanding of the Norwegian model. And I think that's an indication that obviously the dreaded experts who live and breathe this stuff sometimes get slightly frustrated that there's a misunderstanding of the models. And if we had to have a clear debate about our post-Brexit future, first of all, understanding what models there are and how they operate, which is not to say we end up with something which is identical to anybody else's model, but I think that's very helpful to convene these kinds of occasions. Second thing I would say, following on what Michael said, is, we have, by accident or by design, not just in 1973, but subsequently since 2014 and your referendum, a symbiotic relationship, I think, with Switzerland. Certainly it felt like it in Brussels. Every time that Switzerland was discussed in the Committee of Permanent Representatives on which I sat, everybody looked at me. Oddly enough, that was before the referendum, let alone afterwards, because everybody is looking at the reaction to the Swiss referendum result on free movement with a view to what it meant for Brexit and the institutions' reaction to Brexit. And that must have bedeviled your successors' lives in the Swiss administration, and indeed I talk regularly to them. They're very good friends and colleagues of mine about common approaches on these things. But we were always the elephant not in the room for your negotiation, and I suspect vice versa. Everybody looking at the Swiss negotiation in Brussels, French, German colleagues, in particular Italian colleagues, but also the Commission negotiators and the External Action Service people, were always looking at, is this going to set an uncomfortable precedent for a post-Brexit negotiation? So I wanted to say that by way of six quick points, if I can, on partly in reaction to Michael's point, but partly just a few observations I wanted to make of what it looked like to me. First of all, you've heard from Michael, which is, his three principles, I think, are brilliant and should be internalised by the UK administration. What characterises the Swiss approach? You say we have more experience. Well, we have more experience, within, but we haven't had the experience of being a third country in the jargon of Brussels, and you've got a lot of experience of being a third country. There is a whole doctrine around what a third country is and isn't, as you know, in Brussels theology. I think we've got a great deal to learn from you in terms of the sophistication of the approach, and in terms, your point about legal certainty, also legal sophistication, if I can put it like that. I think that's very prevalent in the Swiss system, both in Brussels and back at base. And without wanting to be too unkind about the UK system, I don't think it is terribly prevalent in the UK system. I think the Swiss have recognised from the outside that you have to be very clear, you have to be specific, you have to maximise legal certainty, and you're dealing with a highly legalistic organisation in the European Union. You could not be dealing with a more legalistic environment. And because Britain, like Ireland, like Malta, like Cyprus, is a common law jurisdiction and thinks rather differently about the law and has a rather more pragmatic and less legalistic approach inside its government, we struggle with that perhaps more than you do. But we're going to have to learn, as a third country, a hell of a lot about how to negotiate from the outside. I think you, in practice, as you described, partly through Schengen, partly through membership of the so-called mixed committee, sat regularly around a table with Swiss and Norwegian opposite numbers, we are going to, post-Brexit, be further out of the organs at the centre of Brussels than you are. And we're going to have to think that through and learn from you, I think also the Americans, the Norwegians, the Japanese and others, but above all, I think, the Swiss, about how to do it from the outside. And you have recognised, which I'm not sure our system yet has, dealing with the EU is complex, legalistic, time-consuming, often quite conflictual, despite a high level of integration with the EU, which we have, obviously not as high as yours, but we have. And therefore, we have to recognise that we're going to be embedded for a very long time from the outside if we want any sort of trade and economic deal with the European Union in a very complex lattice work of legal agreements, which, as I've said publicly at select committees, will run to thousands of pages, and I mean thousands of pages. It will not be a quick and dirty, straightforward trade deal. There is no such thing with the European Union. There is also no such thing with the United States. Second thing I would say is what you've heard from Michael is very accurate, I think, which is, you know, the Swiss population has many of the same reactions and views, I think, as the UK population to EU institutions and structures and processes. And, you know, we have long, noble, democratic traditions. They obviously differ, you know, Switzerland and the UK, but, I mean, there's something which is rather different about us. Can you imagine the Swiss in monetary union with the rest of the European Union? Can you imagine us in it? I think the same applies. I think you have the same reflex, which is running through the British political debate now, but I think you've thought more about it in the last 20, 25 years, a reflex against political integration as a concomitant of deeper trade liberalisation. That's going to cause us a bigger problem than it causes you, above all on the services sector, and I can come back to that. But I think over the last 20 to 25 years, maybe longer, you've had the same debates about the trade-offs between market access and sovereignty as we are now having in this country. And we're only starting to have them in this country. This is a debate that's going to carry on for the next couple of decades. We should look very carefully at the Swiss decisions and what they have done in response to those trade-offs. They reflect deep thought plus depth of negotiation. It's not to say we'll always come out in the same place, but I think we should think very carefully about the Swiss model, because an awful lot of what you're saying about the pros and cons of the Swiss model resonates with me. Third thing I think I would say is one can overstate the similarities between the UK and Switzerland, as you say, obviously scale and size and geographical proximity. But I think of specific policy areas, for example, like agriculture. That's not a criticism, incidentally, of the Swiss model any more than it would be of the Norwegian model. But you have a country, your vote, rather like our vote, I think, on Brexit, demonstrated, you know, there's an awfully big difference between public attitudes in Zurich than in Graubünden. And if you look at what the vote was on free movement of people, oddly enough, it was in the more rural and distant areas of Switzerland that there was a hugely negative vote. Exactly. And in Zurich, people were much more relaxed about cosmopolitan, globalized, you know, European Union relations. You see all the, I mean, I had been saying to colleagues around the Brussels circuit and around my Sherpa circuit since 2011 when I rejoined government that I thought they were massively underestimating the risks of Brexit. I was even more convinced of it after February the 3rd of 2014, because you look at the Swiss vote, you look at the dynamics of the Swiss vote, you look at where that vote crystallised and around what, you think all of that's bound to happen in the UK in a referendum, and it did. It's the somewheres versus anywheres, as a certain chairman once put it, and the same phenomenon in Switzerland as you have in the UK. Now, Switzerland is not, by definition, going to be a world leader in agricultural trade liberalisation. Let's be candid. Neither is Norway. Right. You both protect more heavily than the common agricultural policy. You do so for good reason, and you'd have a revolution on your hands if you didn't. The same applies to Norway.
You're the champions of protectionism.
You're the champions of agricultural protectionism. You defeat even the European Union and Japan. Now, I hope, obviously, personally, as an ex-Treasury man who used to do agriculture for a living, that we end up protecting much less heavily than both you and the European Union, and indeed than the US and Japan. And I hope we go in a sort of rather more New Zealand-type liberalising direction. I'm a free trader. But if we do, the one lesson I would learn from the Swiss and from others is we're going to have to think hugely about the regional implications of that inside the UK on agriculture, because we'll do agriculture, we'll do trade deals as a single UK, but they will have very differential distributional impacts across the United Kingdom. And the people who will suffer most from agricultural trade liberalisation will not be the consumers, obviously they'll benefit from it, but will be producers, above all in the poorer areas of the UK and above all in the hillside regions, which are our poor man's version of the Swiss mountain regions. And that's Scotland, and that's Wales, and that's Lakeland Hills. So the fine agriculture of southeastern England will be fine and competitive at world market prices, but a hell of a lot else won't be. We need to have a proper, serious debate about that. Fourth issue, if you look at how the Swiss have managed their relationship with the EU, and I did a lot, and as I say, I've talked a lot to very good Swiss colleagues, they've prioritised ruthlessly and accepted where they can expect to have little traction against a very big and inflexible beast in an asymmetrical relationship. And they've been prepared to pay quite a heavy price, in all honesty, for maximising market access. To their biggest single market. And that has meant what? It's meant substantial ongoing cash, the dog that hasn't yet barked in the UK debate, but it will bark soon. It will bark soon. Make one prediction tonight. The substantial ongoing cash will bark sooner or later, probably a bit later, but it's coming back. Free movement of people, which we've just discussed. I'm very happy to talk about safeguard clauses. As you can imagine, I examined 14.2 and virtually every other aspect of safeguard clauses when working for David Cameron. We went through this. Just as a parenthesis on this, David, because it might be useful to explain this debate. I mean, we looked at all the safeguard clauses in EEA agreements, your agreements, every safeguard clause. I've been through every one in the book, as you can imagine, preparing the renegotiation. The problem with them all was they were nearly all linked with kind of macroeconomic disturbances. And macroeconomic data and your excellent formulae, none of which I understood, but we looked at formulae. The trouble is, we didn't really have a macroeconomic problem. And indeed, I won't go into details about discussions between David Cameron and other key European leaders, but that in a sense was a lot the stumbling block, because people said, well, what's your problem, David? I mean, unemployment's low and falling, you're in a better economic condition than us. There's no macroeconomic disturbance in the UK. What's the problem? And his problem was the problem you're alluding to in your books. The problem was not a macroeconomic problem. It wasn't a problem that UK unemployment was high. It wasn't a problem that there was some major macroeconomic disturbance that you could put in a formula. And that was a problem we needed as almost a sort of political safeguard clause, because it was to do with the pressures on public services and public perceptions and political reaction to sheer numbers of people coming. And that's very difficult to put in a safeguard clause. But that's by the by. Free movement of people, you know, and as you say, the rejection of free movement of people on the existing terms by the Swiss public in a vote which looked very like ours, 50.3 to 49.7, as I recall, brought the whole nexus of EU-Swiss relations to the verge of crashing down, because the EU did what it always does, which it links everything with everything else, because that's how it negotiates. And the other thing is you've accepted, I think, and you've just said so in terms of regulation, and I'll say a little bit more on that, major constraints on sovereignty. More major constraints on sovereignty, I think, than our political class, or most of our political class, is currently up for. And I think we're going to have the same debate on that, and it's starting to break out. Now, more specifically, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm obviously doing this largely from memory and a bit of internet research, the Swiss Goods Mutual Recognition Agreement only works because Swiss laws are exactly the same as EU ones in 20, that's 20, regulated goods sectors. There's no choice there. The Swiss have surrendered basically autonomy and sovereignty and said we go with European norms, regulations and standards because we want full market access.
Correct.
When the Prime Minister talks in her Mansion House speech of ambitious managed divergence, she may have some similar ideas on certain regulated goods sectors, but a much smaller number of sectors and much more cherry-picking than the Swiss go for. The Swiss basically accept lock, stock and barrel in goods in a large number of regulated sectors which are not unilaterally defined by the Swiss EU rule-taking and standard-taking. They accept, as Michael has just said, a modified version of free movement of people, but that version does not give the freedom that we have to provide services on a cross-border basis. Cross-border provision is only possible for a certain number of days per person per year. And for stays of more than about 8 days, I think, the canton must be notified. So it's a very different model of cross-border service provision. And the most competitive part of the UK economy is services, financial services, business services, legal services, tertiary education services. The things in which we have a major surplus with the European Union are services. And if we ended up with a Swiss model on services, it would be extremely bad for the UK economy on all evidence I've seen. Third point I would make is equivalence. I don't want to get too technical for this audience, but I think it's an important point. The Commission doctrine has been directed against you, which is about to be directed against us. And it's deployed pretty ruthlessly against you, and it will be against us to exert pressure on connected dossiers. Look at what, for example, the Commission did, which was a pretty shameless manoeuvre against the Swiss to roll over for only 1 year equivalence for the Swiss Stock Exchange. Pretty brutal, pretty unjustified, pretty politicised, but they did it for a reason, and that's kind of what they do. And they're going to do the same to us in response to the Prime Minister's bid for a rolling, dynamic, mutual recognition. I can tell you already, I've heard any number of reactions from Berlin and Paris and Brussels which say, no, no way, never, hell will freeze over, we'll go for an equivalence model, not a mutual recognition model. And equivalence, why? Because equivalence preserves European Union sovereignty and says, we'll be the arbiter of whether your rules and regulations are equivalent to ours. You're no part of a reciprocal, rolling and dynamic mutual recognition model. And fourthly, I think participation in EU programs, which notably Horizon 2020, in which the Swiss is a very major and very highly respected and appreciated partner by the European Union, one of the reasons why I think the EU did indeed want the deal all along. But the response from the EU side on Horizon 2020 following the free movement of people referendum was again to play hardball, deliberate, clear demonstration of sort of power games and suspend access to Horizon 2020 until the Swiss came back into line on the free movement question. So, final point I would make is this equivalence of mutual recognition point, which I think is very critical. The EU will respond, has responded already, really, and if you look at the guidelines and read the guidelines that the EU side produced in March for the March European Council intelligently, what they're saying, predictably enough to the Prime Minister, indeed I predicted it publicly several months ago, is consistent with your red lines, and the 4 red lines she's drawn up are trade policy and sovereignty, i.e. outside the customs union, ending ECJ jurisdiction, and ending free movement of people, therefore you're outside the single market, and ending very sizable contributions to the EU budget. Consistent with that, all we can ever offer you is the Canadian model. I think this is overdone, but it didn't surprise me remotely that they said it and said, if that's where you are and those are your red lines and those red lines are immutable, all we can offer you is a bog standard, cookie cutter, free trade deal, which will be fine for us on goods and screw you over on services. That's basically, that was entirely predictable, and as I say, I was not alone in predicting it. And that's where the debate currently is. And if you read the guidelines, it basically sets that out very bluntly and says that's the maximum, given that your aversion to political integration behind trade liberalisation, that's the maximum that we can offer you because you don't want any more integration with us and you want to be even further out than Switzerland and certainly much further out than Norway, and if that's your ongoing position, then the corollary of that is you'll have much less market access. Now, of course, there's a negotiating element in that, but there's also an element of truth behind, and it goes back to what Michael said, which is there is a trade-off here, and there's a trade-off coming. I think the public debate here and elsewhere would benefit from more honesty about there are trade-offs. If we want, as we look at the future of the UK economy outside Brexit, and incidentally I think the negotiation and the FTAs are grossly overstated in their importance, whereas the broader domestic productivity agenda is grossly understated in its importance. If we say we want to diverge more and more substantially across goods and in services sectors, the corollary of that is we will have much less market access into the EU market. We may be able to live with that, and there are consequences from that, but I think we need a more honest political debate about the trade-offs between market access and sovereignty, and whether we want more divergence as a goal in itself because we think that if we're free and autonomous we'll take better decisions and ultimately the economy will benefit, or more convergence because we want more market access on an immediate basis. The Swiss have gone for more convergence, basically. with exceptions and in various sectors, but have gone for more convergence. You know, the question that faces our political class, which I'm not sure we're having a very honest debate about, is whether we want more divergence, and if so, what do we want to do with it?
Thank you very much. Allie has very kindly agreed to shorten her contribution so that we do have, I mean, I think we can go a little bit over 7:30, but over to you, Allie.
Thank you. Sorry for being late. I've been back and forth to Northern Ireland all week. I'm just coming in from Dublin. It's interesting actually listening to some of the descriptions about the Swiss model, and I think maybe this is actually why you're starting to see, I wouldn't call it sort of outright opposition or hostility, but a lot more latent antipathy from some quarters of the Conservative Party and some of the Leave camp towards the Swiss model, because it looked great on paper. You weren't actually bound by the rules of the single market in a dynamic fashion. And then you peeled back the layers of what it meant in practice, and it looks slightly different. And I could see actually, I think actually, to be honest, if the Daily Mail was listening to some of the things that were put forward, they would say absolutely no way in high heaven, leaving aside the free movement question, because it just in practice seems like too much of a loss of sovereignty over rules, generally speaking. So just quickly, the four things I think to draw upon for the UK from the Swiss, I hate using the word model because it's kind of more of a description of a process that's taken sort of, X number of years. But I do like the fact that, when Michel Barnier goes around with his kind of sliding scale map, the Swiss are on there, and even though some may say belatedly it's not a menu of choices, I think it's actually very helpful to have it on there. I think he's actually mistakenly characterized it, because I think the reason that they have that sliding scale of everywhere from Norway to Switzerland to association agreement to Turkey is to say what does and doesn't cross UK government, putative government red lines. And interestingly, under the Swiss model, it says this would not satisfy the UK government's demand for regulatory autonomy, i.e. the Swiss have no regulatory autonomy, which I thought was a pretty drastic oversimplification of what the actual reality of it is. I would say the Swiss have certain levels of regulatory autonomy that certainly Norway do not. But the first thing I think just quickly to look at is drawing on that, the fact that at the end of the day, there is so much cherry picking that goes on in the way that the EU does some of its trade agreements. It probably is not going to do an individual, really sort of sector by sector approach to the nth degree of these are the different rules that we're going to have mutual recognition versus equivalence versus harmonization on. But it does show, I think, that there is that sort of potential to have different levels of access corresponding to different levels of regulatory alignment. I think for all intents and purposes, to my mind, and I'm always conscious of nervous about doing this in front of someone who is actually has done this from the Swiss perspective, but some people would say that the Swiss are effectively in the single market for goods and not for services. And so actually that to me, when someone was talking about earlier that you can't, can you have this sort of fundamental divide of the four freedoms, I think sometimes what the EU means by that actually is putting the heavy emphasis on the free movement of people. That's the one that they don't want to break away from, where in fact actually in some of the other models you do have some of this differentiation between access levels on goods versus services. And I think, to be honest, when you looked at Theresa May's most recent speech, which was, I think, the most honest to date, she did basically say, even though she kind of limited to rules on industrial standards, which is hard to understand because standards mean different things. There are voluntary standards and then there are regulatory standards. But she basically said, went as far as saying, we're probably going to stay the same on industrial goods, and yes, explicitly we acknowledge that means that that's going to limit our capacity to change things in the future, but that's the trade-off that we're going to be willing to make. And I personally think that that's actually code for a much wider scoping approach to goods, particularly on actually agri-food, because coming from the US, you know that when people talk about having alignment in the UK sense, meaning sort of equivalent outcomes, the UK and the EU both think they have very high standards, and the EU definitely doesn't recognize the US's SPS regulatory system, because when one side it doesn't have something banned and the other side does, that's very clear that you can't have equivalence. So if for example, and I think this is why actually the single market membership case isn't the slam dunk that some people on the Remain side make it out to be, not just for financial services. In the last couple of months, you had the EU Parliament, not the Commission, was looking at banning glyphosate, which is a chemical pesticide, and farmers from France to the UK were up in arms about it. And I think there is a legitimate question to ask about whether in a situation absent the UK, you would want to continue going down that route with sort of the same automaticity. Having said that, I think the UK government is probably going to come to a stage, particularly unless they agree to the backstop for Northern Ireland, because of the Northern Irish dimension, that they are going to stay fully in step with the EU's agri-food regulatory system, not just have it equivalence. Secondly, briefly, I think that is reflective, particularly in the Swiss model, of how, unfortunately, for those who would like to do really dynamic divergence, particularly on regulations for goods, the UK's geographical proximity is something that means that it really is going to stay in certain areas within the EU's regulatory sphere. It is simply just much easier for that to be the case for a country like the UK and Switzerland, where you have pan-European supply chains that make that kind of difference versus Canada and the rest of the EU. So I think that sort of geographical regulatory pull effect is what's going to keep us in certain areas within that orbit. Thirdly, I think it's quite an opportunity to look and reflect on what is it that the EU doesn't like about the Swiss model, to know that, to inform the UK negotiators about what they might want to add on were they going for a Swiss-type model. So could they expect a guillotine clause? Could they expect a more wide-ranging guillotine clause that the whole sort of sets of agreement fall in terms of the market access consequences, if Parliament votes against a government sort of bringing into force an EU rule, which comes to my last point. Interestingly, it's going to proceed along a different way, but it's quite interesting to look at how the Swiss have had to deal with in Switzerland, it's sort of the public, it seems very tenuous that a referendum, even if it's watered down, could really kind of pull to a halt the whole arrangement. The whole arrangement could come crumbling down. And I think we're going to have something similar, but in the sense of Parliament really is going to be more sovereign than it ever has been before, because effectively what you'll have is the UK government will be transposing EU rules in the areas where it's committed to alignment, and if it gets its way, which is what David Davis says, he wants to get the freedom to diverge and leave it for Parliament to make the decision in those areas, not necessarily to make the divergence now, then you could see a situation whereby the government is very nervous every time that there is a potential defeat on a particular rule, and it has to either go back to the EU and say, I'm sorry, we have to suspend this part of the agreement, or more likely, which is what seems to happen in Switzerland, is effectively try and water it down to make it sort of satisfy both parties. I don't think it's going to fly here in the UK in the same way as in Switzerland. I think the media will be scrutinizing EU rules like never before, from the most banal and innocuous to those that really can make an impact on the UK's economic competitiveness. So I don't think the watering down exercise will be that easy here.
Well, thank you very much. Now, I think we can exercise a bit of sovereignty and just decide to go on for another 10 minutes or so. So I wonder, Chris Bickerton, do you want to? There's a microphone coming your way.
I had just a couple.
Just say who you are.
Sorry, Chris Bickerton, Cambridge University. Just two very quick comments. The Swiss model is interesting for lots of reasons, but my reading of the negotiations thus far is that it's one of the things that are simply not being offered. Precisely because the nature of the Swiss model is that there is a high degree of cherry picking. It's evolved in this way where some areas are absorbed into EU law, and in some areas the Swiss do their own thing. What's come out from the Commission and what's been articulated by Michel Barnier is a very different approach. The harmony of the four freedoms, it's a take it or leave it. There is no, and they've said this a zillion times, there is no cherry picking. So in some ways the Swiss model question is moot. It's not being offered to the UK. But what is interesting, I think, to think about for the Swiss model is that if we think of all the good things that Switzerland has as an economy and as a society, it's worth asking the question, are they due to the particular rules and regulations and relationship that Switzerland has to the European Union? I would say no. And in that respect, I think Ivan's final point is maybe the most important. We can debate trade issues forever, but the future of the British economy hangs on its ability to solve its productivity problem. And the Swiss model is a Swiss model that's very interesting, but for reasons other than its particular bilateral relations with the European Union.
Are we doing one at a time or grouping them?
Oh, go on, go ahead.
I see the point with the first one. I don't necessarily agree with your conclusion on that. I think it's far too early in the process to tell what the EU is ruling out, quite frankly. It's put out guidelines, but the extent to which we know whether something is or isn't viable rests on knowing what the UK government is actually proposing. We don't actually know that yet. All we know is that there is this general sort of approach to sort of baskets, and that maybe industrial standards would be something we stay aligned to, but we don't have any of the detail of knowing what kind of cherry picking in the sense the UK government is actually putting forward. And I would actually go back to Michael's earlier point, which was to say a lot of the flexibility of the EU seems to be around the implementation point. And so, I actually envisage some very interesting things going on in the legal scrubbing part of the agreement for both sides. I think you'll get the agreement, and people will be able to, even in the trade agreement, potentially read in different things that they want, and then you'll get this legal scrubbing period, and things may become tighter for the UK, but may become more flexible in how the EU approaches it. So I'm not sure I would rule it out completely.
Do you want to respond?
Just one, I mean, a couple of very quick points. One, I think we already do know that they're not going to agree ambitious managed divergence. I can explain why they're not going to agree in greater detail, but I think it's crystal clear, not only from the guidelines, but from every conversation I and others have had. No, but I mean, what the Prime Minister asked for at the Mansion House speech, the answer to that is clear and unequivocal no. I mean, we already know that, and she already knows that. So the question of the debate is obviously going to move on beyond that. And they're not going to allow a British decision in specific areas to say, well, we'll converge on those, we'll diverge to a limited extent but have similar outcomes via a different route on those, and we'll have radical divergence on those, and we'll be the arbiters of, obviously that's not going to fly. On your final point, I mean, the thing that worries me, look, I'm a trade liberal, and I'm a multilateral trade liberal, and I'm a trade liberaliser and a free trader. I'm very pro-free trade. I think it dominates the debate we were discussing before we started to an extraordinary degree. I mean, I'm pro all these deals, but with the best will in the world. I mean, I made the case in the 1990s for a free trade deal when working for Leon Britton in the Commission 22 years ago for an EU-US free trade deal. I've been through this course with Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, every other. I'm very pro them. The best estimate you could ever put on the best bloody trade deal you could ever do transatlantically, it's not very big in macroeconomic terms. And we did loads of work inside Whitehall and loads of work inside the European Commission. I'm very pro, if you can't make progress in the WTO multilaterally, and let's face it, Leon Britton was the last person to conclude a trade round, the Uruguay round, which is now 24 years ago. The WTO isn't going to conclude great multilateral breakthroughs in trade. Why have we all gone to regionalism and bilateralism and these grand regional deals? Because the WTO is incapable of doing. We want this glorious British leadership in the WTO. That's all fine. There aren't going to be glorious new breakthroughs in the WTO at the multilateral level. It's become too difficult. That's why everybody's gone down the regional route. So I'm very pro then the UK taking a leadership role and having bilateral trade deals and doing our damnedest with fast-growing emerging economies to do them. Even with the best will in the world, if you top all of them up and think you can do all of them and think you can implement them and think they have a big hit rate over the next 10 years, they don't add a large quantum to the UK economy. Okay. So your key point is the productivity of the UK economy.
Can I just butt in and just ask, picking up on Chris's second point, really, I mean, how, people are starting to talk a bit more about, I mean, the debate's been dominated by single market access and customs unions and things, but people are beginning to sort of think about the possibilities of reclaimed sovereignty, about, the kind of rebooting Britain after Brexit idea is beginning to kind of emerge. Well, I don't think we've had nearly enough thinking about this, but, if we want to have, if we want to solve the funding gap problem for high-tech startups, via some kind of, state aid, seed investment, if we want to have radical regional policy, no corporation tax paid at all in the North East and South Wales, and change public procurement rules, the way the EU public procurement rules have kind of thwarted the construction industry, I mean, is a frightening story in many ways. I mean, if we want to do all those things, what can we hope to get?
We were discussing before, and I think it's a very important question, and it goes to this divergence question. If that's what you want to do, there won't be a free trade deal with the European Union. Because, now there's a lot of hypocrisy in this on the European Union side of the table, but there will be level playing field provisions in the political agreement from this autumn, especially on state aids and competition mergers policy, on tax policy, on environment policy, and maybe on social policy. We know that's coming. I mean, the British government knows that's coming. No, perfectly well. That's in the works in the next 6 months. And I don't know the political reaction here, because there will be people inside both parties, I think, who will say, well, hang on, are we then seeing the imposition via the back door, having left after Brexit, of all kinds of things that we rejected through the front door? If you want your zero-rate corporation tax in the northeast of England, the EU will say, well, you can sod off on your trade deal then. So there won't be a preferential trade deal on those terms.
Do you agree with that, Annie?
I mean, I think that there is one, I don't know if it's a key difference, there's one seminal difference no matter how the UK leaves the EU, unless it was going through the EEA, on state aid, which is that it will no longer have to notify the Commission before it does things first, effectively. It will not have to go cap in hand.
True.
And that potentially you could see allowing for, in principle, a bit more flexibility about taking decisions and dealing with consequences later, which is, I guess, how you could say a lot of people work in relation to the WTO. I am a little bit nervous about the Commission overstepping the mark when it comes to tax policy, because I was really intrigued to see there was in the Irish government's paper on Brexit before Enda Kenny left last year. There was a section in the level playing field provision that said, basically they didn't want to say they were thinking of it. Some people have noted the future direction of the UK's corporate tax policy, corporate tax law in this regard, which I thought was a little bit pot calling kettle black, because Ireland's had its own problems around state aid and corporation tax in relation to the EU. But I think the EU should be a little bit careful about doing anything that would effectively give it, some might say, more control over the future direction than it has currently. Because right now, everyone has a veto over this kind of stuff. And is it kind of going to, by the back door, try and put further restrictions in that don't actually, in substantive terms, exist now? But I think, generally speaking, and Theresa May actually, whether it was a dig at Jeremy Corbyn or not, I don't know, she went out of her way to explicitly reference state aid as something that would maintain full alignment with, not sort of, prevaricating, not sort of, sort of being equivocal about it. She was totally unequivocal about it in her speech. So I don't see this an area for seeing much difference at all in terms of the substantive, huge changes to what you can do. I mean, it was interesting, the day after the referendum, the head of Invest Northern Ireland said he couldn't wait to be, probably for obvious reasons, released from the shackles of state aid. And I think a lot of people who are thinking that are going to be disappointed because it's something that the UK government believes in and drove most of the creation of, even if it started to veer more into areas that you could say are a bit more dubious with respect to is state aid really the best place to talk about sort of tax competition principles.
So I'm slightly confused. You said you wouldn't get a free trade deal if you didn't rely on social and environmental policy. But, thank you. But the Canadians have a free trade deal.
Absolutely.
And
which is what I say regularly.
Yeah, do they align on social?
No,
why would they? How could they? So they don't insist on it with Canada, and you're saying they would with us?
No, I am indeed saying that, and I make that argument all the time, and I've been making it for several years because I've seen this one coming. In the end, of course, they're playing it to say they think that the Brits want substantially more than Canada, and they're basically sort of saying if you want substantially more market access than Canada,
just to get Canada.
No, I'm
if
saying
you want to get Canada, I've been saying, and I'm sure my successors have been saying, if you give us a bog standard cookie cutter Canadian deal, then you can't impose level playing field provisions on us because you didn't on Canada.
Which begs the question,
Yeah.
actually.
Well, so we can have state aid and a free trade agreement.
Yes, but you'll have it goods rich and services light, which will screw the UK economy on services.
So 20% of our service, well, of the city, 20% of it.
Yeah, but it's not just financial services, it's business services. I mean, if you look at where we are competitive, it's business services, and you look at where the bulk of our services go, I'm afraid, it's not a pretty picture. And there you could lose very substantial market access through being in a Canadian market access on services is much smaller than Swiss.
Did Barnier seek to have financial services in the CETA originally?
It was included, but not in a... The difference, I think, with this kind of negotiation is that in TTIP, and yeah, it was the EU bullied by the UK pushing to have inclusion.
Bullied by me, actually, to get it into.
The main difference was there is that the way in which, basically in all, not only the EU's, but all free trade agreements, the way financial services is usually included is regulatory cooperation is done, I would say, almost independently of market access. They aren't so inextricably linked, whereas here it's being made clear that the level of access depends on your alignment. In TTIP, they wanted to put it in because they thought it'd be a nice idea to have more cooperation on financial services rules as they were developed, not because they thought they were going to get a huge deal on market access.
Michael, a quick word from you.
Yeah, thank you very much. If I may just give some more information about the Swiss model. First of all, and I agree with Allie, in Switzerland we do not call it Swiss model, we call it, literally translated, Swiss way. So it's a process. Ein bilateraler Weg, that's in German, the Swiss way. We walk on this, and it's a process. And as it is a process, one should, and if I may make this message here very clear, one should not say the Swiss model or the Swiss way means it has to be copy, paste 100% as the Swiss have it. That brings me to the question of liberalization of services. We do not have it, knowing that for other countries, in a Swiss model kind of thing, it might be in there. Why don't we have it? Because we don't want it. Strange enough, but it is like this. The Swiss industry is very skeptical. The Swiss service industry is very skeptical. So for another attempt now in February, was an analysis of the government, and they said we do not ask for a service negotiation. But in the Swiss way doing things, it could be very much included, this service agreement. So if the UK would go for such a model, it would, of course, mutatis mutandis, included. This brings me to the point about cherry picking. I think our friends in Brussels, they use this, of course, because they want to put some pressure on us. But if I may say it very clearly, it's ridiculous. We do not make cherry picking. I mean, the EU gets very much a lot out of these deals. Otherwise, you can bet on it, they would never ever conclude it. Now, what they would not like is that you just take the goodies and you're not ready to also contribute. Yeah. In services, I mean, they're happy that we don't have it. If we would go for services, they would just insist that we do not get a better treatment, let's say, than the Germans or the Greek. Yeah. Because then they say, if you won't have services, you just have the same deal as the Germans or the Greek. And so the advantage here, if you call it pick and choose, is that you pick out what you want, but what you have picked out, there it has to be balanced. Coming to, do they not offer you this? That is what you said. I can imagine. Maybe if you ask for it and you say, we want it, you gave it to the bloody Swiss, why should we not give it, receive it also? Yeah. Then I would bet it would be a different situation. Because once again, there are similarities and there are differences. And one major difference is you are bigger and you have definitively a very professional diplomacy. I mean, you are renowned for this, a very high quality diplomacy. And I'm not sure from the outside, for the European Union, this Brexit is very important. And of course, they do not want to have an encouragement for the other 27. Yeah. That is what I would call the Alcatraz policy. They do not want that you can jump out of, the prison and then swim to the shore and survive. So that is not allowed. Right. That is their concern. But if for me it's sure they also want to have a deal with this important country, the United Kingdom.
Final question. You've been very patient at the back there.
Thank
give
you.
the lady the mic. Yeah.
Thank you. Carol Walker. I'd just like to ask Sir Ivan, there's been a lot of talk and obviously a lot of pressure in Parliament now on this issue of the customs union, which the Prime Minister has ruled out. I wonder if you think that there could be a variation of the Swiss way in terms of the border. A lot of people are talking about the customs union as the only way of resolving the issue about the Irish border. We had this very clear explanation of how the EU-Swiss border works. Do you think that there is a framework around that could work instead of a customs union to resolve this issue of the Irish border? Do you think that there is a prospect that the Prime Minister could pick up something like that? And if I could you just tell us what you think are the chances of getting a deal on a future arrangement and getting it through Parliament in October?
Right.
Just a quick one at the end. Sorry for that.
That's the easy one, isn't it? Yeah, easy one last. Look, I mean, obviously, I don't know what the thinking inside Whitehall is on how to react to the Commons vote, and I don't know which way the Commons vote would go on a customs union with the customs union. I assume that will crystallise sometime in the next few weeks and it'll get pushed in the Commons. But the amendment in the Lords is not actually terribly specific, so we'll see what the Commons does with it. And I obviously don't know the numbers on the vote. The question comes back, and Allie will want to say something about this because she's produced her own paper, or the IOD has produced its paper on a sort of partial customs union idea. People are a little bit too fundamentalist on what membership of a customs union does and does not preclude. So, and I looked at this, myself, both before the referendum and after the referendum, of what would the model, because you could all see what this debate would be like, and the debate was quite lively in Cabinet, as you can imagine, in 2016 after the referendum on whether to remain in the customs union or not, and the pros and cons, and the economics of the decision. And then I was looking personally and asking my staff to look at a kind of hybrid model. Could you have a sort of partial customs union? Could you resolve some of the goods issues but have autonomy in services? Would that get you anything? Would you be able to then negotiate trade deals around services and other elements? Or would that not give you enough negotiating leverage in third countries? I assume quite a lot of that thinking will be going on in Whitehall, but I have no idea where it will land up. And Allie might want to say about the IOD proposition for trying to square the circle and say, well, we can do some serious trade deals with interesting third countries, but without having full autonomy or without abandoning a customs union. So I think there are options in the customs union space. What I've no idea, she's been reasonably unequivocal in the Mansion House speech and subsequently about ruling that out and saying, I'm leaving the customs union. She has, after all, set up the Ministry for International Trade. And when I was there, when she did so, people immediately said, well, she's taken the decision to leave the customs union. What else can it mean? I mean, why you have an Department for International Trade unless you're leaving the customs union? So the politics of this are one thing. Then the economics of, is there some sort of hybrid model which enables you to have as much as you might want in regulated goods? What's the concern behind the customs union issue on both sides of the house? It's that in the regulated sectors of the goods economy, you know, above all, I suppose, automotive, aerospace, pharmaceuticals and chemicals, but some others, the implications of being outside the customs union on disruption of the supply chain might be so severe as to see substantial relocations of business outside the UK and into the EU27. That's the question. Now, then the question is, can you develop some WISO customs partnership which replicates many of the merits of the customs union without being in a customs union, and does that work? That's a very complex question. The technology question is also very complex on the Irish border. On the Ireland question, look, let's not go there tonight because otherwise we won't leave before midnight. But you know the problem, which is in the December deal, both sides signed up to there being three potential ways through the Irish problem. Either you have an overall economic deal which is sufficient, keeps sides sufficiently close that there's no need for a hard border, that's so-called option A. Everybody's reading of that on the other side of the channel is that the Prime Minister's Mansion House speech, like the Lancaster House and Florence one, means that that's not a runner. The Brits have therefore focused above all on option B, the technical and technological solution. That candidly, you know, from everything I've heard from various places, is still viewed as a bit of a fantasy island unicorn model, and they haven't seen anything.
It works for Switzerland.
Well, no, that's not the same. That's not quite the same thing.
Just do everything on pre-clearance. And
that's not quite. Well, Ali can elaborate, but I mean, what I'm giving you is both the Irish and the Brussels and the Berlin and the Paris reaction that I've heard personally of kind of, we haven't actually seen anything from the British side since August last year in the paper that first outlined this, and we need to know more detail of how you envisage a customs partnership going. The Irish and Brussels in particular, but I think back to, as far as I can see, by Berlin and Paris, have said the only solution to this is the so-called backstop, which is option C, which is what the Commission then put in print and then got the toxic reaction both from the DUP and from the Prime Minister. At the moment, the two sides seem to me, but is this predictable at this stage of a negotiation? They're talking past each other. The Brits are sort of saying, well, it's around option A and option B that we want to discuss. And the Irish are predictably saying the only interesting option is option C, and there's not going to be a withdrawal treaty unless there's an option C in it. So that's where we are.
Final word from Allie.
Yeah, just quickly, I mean, I'm not going to go into details of what we talked about. You do hear this sort of expression that basically customs union, a customs, and I think just to I know we get hung up on definite articles, but I care about it because we're leaving the customs union the minute, in my opinion, we decided to leave the EU. And the big difference between the customs union and a customs union is if you're a member of the customs union, you cannot even negotiate the trade agreements, let alone what the scope of what's covered in it. In a customs union, you can, and we'd suggested something that was narrowed in terms of what it covered and left you with more space on agriculture to negotiate the tariffs down. But to your point about, you know, relating it to the Swiss, I mean, the reason why the question of a customs union becomes such an issue is that everywhere else in the world, and as it's more referred to in EU speak and everywhere else, if you are not the member, if you are a member of a differing customs territory, i.e. you have different import tariffs, that's always been where the delineation of a border actually is. That's always been the case everywhere in the world. And the sort of the physical controls relating to regulatory issues is just built on top of that, but that's usually the big delineator. And so effectively, and it was interesting to read the Northern Irish Affairs Committee, which is made up a majority of Leave MPs, including several, Kate Hoey and from Northern Ireland, went out of their way to say, what we're looking for doesn't exist yet. Could the government please put forward what its ideas are? And actually, in relation to the Swiss border, I think there's a lot of things that you can, listening to some of the evidence given from the Swiss customs experts a few months ago, that you can pull off in terms of bilateral cooperation between customs authorities. But make no mistake, there is physical infrastructure for commercial freight going across the Swiss border. It's very different for people versus trucks that are going across it. And even if, I think the whole sort of debate around what is the percentage of goods that are inspected in relation to the Irish context is irrelevant. The difference is that there is infrastructure to allow those checks, even if it's 1%, to be made, and no one is saying that people are saying they don't want the infrastructure. And it was interesting to listen to the language from Bob Stewart when he came back he's on the Northern Irish Affairs Committee. When he came back, the committee came back from looking at the Swiss-German and Swiss-French and I think Swiss-Italian border, and his words were, it's a bit too bureaucratic for what we want, i.e. there is infrastructure there and we have to get away from that. So I would make no mistake that as
But we do already have number plate recognition technology, don't we, quite at the main crossing points already on the border? I mean, do you need anything more than that?
Well, in terms of having the extra cameras to monitor it, which PSNI have said they don't want, and it was interesting, you got a lot of noise about this Smart Borders 2.0 report that came out from Lars Carlson, and I think the DUP got sort of excited about it, and there's quite interesting things in there. Having said that, it still proposed things like e-gates, which is physical infrastructure, and finally, actually, about 3 weeks ago, when they were asked by a Conservative backbench MP, Suella Fernandez and David Davis both explicitly said, no, this doesn't meet our objectives. So we know that what the government are looking for is untested. That's why they've put forward this new unprecedented customs partnership model where you have different basically tariff import regimes at the border. So I think just being cognizant of the fact that no, it doesn't exist out there. No, the Swiss isn't what we want for the Irish border. Yes, we have to think in very, very different ways about what's gone before.
Well, thank you very much. Do you want a very, very quick final word from Michael? But you started it, you should finish it.
Thank you very much. Now, on the customs question, I believe that if you would have only a technical, economic, demographic, transport problem, the Swiss way doing customs with the Germans and the French, Italian is very much a model. And it shows that we have much, much more traffic. I mean, we have 20,000 trucks and we have 1 billion of goods. We solve it. No problem. No complaints at all. It's solved. And if we solve it, you could solve it on this small land border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. What is totally different, of course, and I accept, is the political question. I think this is my point of view. It's a purely political question for historical questions, the Good Friday Agreement and so on, and the question of visibility, noticeability, and all this. If this would not be there, this is a psychological, I'm not making a value judgment. I'm not saying it does not exist because it's psychological. But if this would not be there, the message from the Swiss is it's solvable.
Well, thank you all very much. Thank you to Ralph and Chris on the Policy Exchange side. Thank you also to Daniela for getting Michael here and helping everything to happen on the Swiss side. And thank you very much. Can we say thank you to our speakers?
Very good. That's a very good.